100% synthetic or full synthetic? Are they actually different? Is one really better than the other? Hi, I'm Lake, the motor oil geek. You know, synthetic motor oils are often misunderstood. And that's because most people don't understand Group 5 base oils. So let's connect with my good friend Rafe Briton, the lubrication expert, to get you the 101 on Group 5 base oils and to answer those questions. A quart of motor oil is about 80% base oil and 20% added or so. When it comes to that base oil though, you know, the API classifies 5 different groups, and that leads to quite a bit of confusion.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, groups 1 and 2 are just essentially mineral-based stocks. You know, it's crude oil that's just been processed to some degree. But then we get into the group 3s, and that becomes confusing because within group 3 you have GTL, which is what, you know, the Pennzoil Ultra Platinum made from natural gas. Yep. That's technically a group 3, but so is a hydrocracked crude. So while in many places, say around the world, everyone considers GTL a true synthetic, a lot of people don't consider Group 3, a hydrocracked Group 3, a true synthetic. Like, you can't market a Group 3 and say, like, Germany has a synthetic, but you could GTL. Nerd alert, we're deep diving on base oil chemistry this time, but don't be intimidated. I'm from Mississippi. If I can understand it, you can too. Plus, Rafe is a great teacher. He'll make it easy to understand. Of course, then there's the Group 4, PAO, which we've covered in a previous video. And then there's Group 5.
Group 5 is the interesting one, right?
Yeah.
This is where I think lubricants kind of get cool, in my opinion, is in Group 5. Now, in the engine oil world, we don't tend to think of Group 5s all that much, right?
They're really not that common.
Yeah, is actually a kind of catch-all term for everything that is not in Groups 1 through 4. Now, I think there's a common misconception. Sometimes people think that as the number goes up, the quality goes up.
Absolutely.
Right? And as we go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, yeah, that kind of holds true.
Yeah.
Group 5 is where that rule breaks, because Group 5 just means it wasn't in 1, 2, 3, or 4. So as an example, a vegetable oil, that would count as a Group 5.
Straight olive oil.
Yeah, exactly, right? And hey, we've used castor oil in things like aviation engines and stuff before.
Two-stroke racing engines still run on castor bean oil. That's what my dad and I use in our vintage go-karts, is castor bean oil.
Yeah, and actually kind of where the name Castrol comes from as well, right?
Right, yeah.
So if you're British, castor oil, you might say it that way, and that's where you get the term Castrol. So we can do vegetable-derived or kind of bio-derived products, but it also encompasses all sorts of other stuff that can be very high performance or very low performance, right? So examples would be, you've got phosphate esters. Now, I come from the industrial world. Phosphate esters are usually used in the hydraulic control systems for steam turbines.
Yes.
Diesters would typically be used in things like air compressor oils. Polyol esters, actually all of the jet turbine oils. So in the aviation world, anytime you get on an aircraft, all of those products are polyol esters. And that's actually a mandated rule from the FAA.
Yes.
Because all of those products, whether they're made by Mobil, Eastman, you know, anyone, Nyko, they all must be compatible with each other, because you can imagine, safety-wise, you do not want an incompatibility problem when you are 30,000 feet in the air.
No.
So you've got those kinds of products. Polyalkylene glycols, very common in worm gear drive applications and gas compression. And then you've got some really exotic ones like the silicons and the fluoroalkanes.
Yeah.
You know, there's some really cool stuff.
EFPs are really cool. Like, it's not a hydrocarbon, it's carbon and fluorine. So you substitute the hydrogen for the fluorine, PFPEs, basically you can use it in a pure vacuum, which is space, and it will not evaporate.
Yeah, and incredibly chemically stable as well. So if you work in the chemicals industry or nuclear, they're almost impervious to radiation and things like that too. There's some mystery surrounding it, but the SR-71, so if anyone's familiar with the Blackbird, the single coolest aircraft that has ever been created.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And you probably are aware of some of the stories around, let's say, for example, when it was designed to leak fuel while it was on the ground.
Yeah.
Right? So the idea being that as the titanium skin expanded, right, because it was going so fast, it would heat up. As the titanium skin expanded, then it would kind of paper over all the leaks, and we would finally have a sealed aircraft. Well, actually, the lube oil system for the SR-71 was really cool. They used an actual lubricant which had to perform at a consistent temperature of 350 degrees Celsius. Now, most of the lubricants that we have today would thermally degrade at that kind of temperature. So they had to use a product which was solid at room temperature. So you couldn't start the engines without preheating the lube oil system because the lube oil was literally a brick, right, before you got the engine started. So Group 5 can really span everything, right, from basically recycled, nasty garbage through to, vegetable and bio-derived products, all the way through to the highest performance lubricants that we have.
100% synthetic or full synthetic, those are just marketing terms and not technical definitions. Just because a label says it's 100% synthetic doesn't mean that it's a Group 4, Group 5, PAO ester blend. And just because it says full synthetic doesn't mean it's a Group 3. We actually analyzed this oil in a previous video. It says full synthetic, but we know that it contains a Group 5 alkylated naphthalene. So unfortunately, just looking at the label doesn't tell you what's in the bottle. Right. And what's neat is Group 5s can be used in some applications as that is the only oil, like the jet turbine oil. That's all that it is. But then you can also use Group 5s as a co-base stock, which is where most PAO applications come in, needs a co-base stock, because while PAOs have incredible properties and they're really great, they do have a couple of disadvantages. Like nothing is perfect. There's always a trade-off when it comes to the chemical world. And with PAOs, they lack solvency. So you need to put something in the PAO to provide additive solvency. We mentioned this in a previous video about the history of Mobil 1. The original Mobil 1 was PAO, but it contained Group 1 base oil to solubilize the additives. Then they went to PAO ester, because the ester would provide some seal swells and things like that. So esters can bring in, as a Group 5, some lubricity. They can bring in that solvency. The only downside to esters really in that PAO ester blend is some esters are extremely polar. To the point they will compete against the additives.
Yep. And that's such a shame, because with the additives, usually the most expensive part of the formulation, right? And that's really, I call it the KFC secret herbs and spices of any lubricant formulation. You spend all this money putting the additives in only for your base oil to outcompete them at the metal surface, right? So we're always looking for alternative co-bases. And?
So one that's been around for a while and is actually way more common than people realize is alkylated naphthalene. We're actually here at King Industries in their new plant in Connecticut, where they actually make alkylated naphthalenes. So if any of you guys happen to be like big fans of, say, Mobil 1 extended performance, it contains alkylated naphthalene. It's what they're using to provide not just that solvency to be that co-base stock with the PAO or whatever else is in there. It actually has its own antioxidant properties. And it has a higher pressure viscosity coefficient. Again, back to one of the drawbacks or the limitations of pure PAO is PAO has a very low pressure viscosity coefficient. And to understand what that is, if you think about, say, like a ball bearing rolling in a race, that contact pressure, when that oil For example, say a group 1 base oil under that very high contact pressure will become a solid.
Yeah.
Well, that's not necessarily a good thing, because now you don't have flow, you don't have the ability to conduct the heat away. On the flip side, a PAO the viscosity really doesn't increase that much. It kind of goes to a point and then flatlines. In really high contact areas, you need that basically viscosity to increase to prevent metal on metal contact. So a higher pressure viscosity coefficient is actually really beneficial, especially when you're talking about very low viscosity oils. And we're talking about going now to 0W8 and 12 and 16 and 20. 0W20 in a diesel. That's still insane. I'm not saying that I agree with that yet. We're getting some data, at Speed Diagnostics, doing diesel oil analysis that's making me kind of question that decision-making process from GM, but we'll get to that later. But when you have those kind of high loads, a higher pressure viscosity coefficient can be your friend.
Yeah. So alkylated naphthalene is such a cool molecule. So obviously Lake is the motor oil geek. I'm like the industrial oil geek.
Yes.
And probably the nerdiest thing that I've ever said is that alkylated naphthalene is my favorite base oil, right?
You're starting to win me over on this a little bit. My favorite is Metallocene Catalyst PAO 100. His is this. Maybe we could do like a, Reese's or something where we combine them together. It's the chocolate and the peanut butter.
That would be perfect. So one of the reasons why we don't see it dominate engine oil formulations is, as we said, every oil has its Achilles heel. And in the case of alkylated naphthalenes, it has a lower viscosity index than some of the other synthetic lubricants.
Yeah, I feel like that's where it gets a bad rap, is because so many people fixate on that spec sheet, and VI is, they live and die by it. Back to our pressure viscosity coefficient. In that contact area, a high VI but a low pressure viscosity coefficient may not build as much of a film as something that with a lower VI but a higher pressure viscosity coefficient. Like we've mentioned before, and the reason we did the first video on the Valvoline Restore and Protect is because the spec sheet doesn't tell you everything about the performance of the oil. It's physical properties, and yes, sometimes those physical properties do align with real-world performance, but not always.
Just an additional point there. With viscosity index, I get why in engine oils it is a significant number. In a lot of industrial applications, not so important. Because if you think about a lot of industrial plants, these things tend to operate 24/7, right? So rather than having a stop and a start, we're constantly operating at a single temperature, in which case we don't mind the fluctuation in viscosity across temperature. Right? But in engine oils, where we're prioritizing VI, generally where you'll see this kind of thing in its applications is as a co-base, right? So at a treat rate of that sort of 5 to 10% is pretty typical.
And what's neat is we've seen that adding this, basically substituting an ester with an AN increases oxidation stability. Which everyone thinks, well, esters are more thermally stable and all this, and we've literally taken a 10% treat rate of ester and chopped it down to 2%, replaced the rest of that with AN, and increased the PDSE, the oxidation stability time, just by doing that.
Yeah, and a lot of that sort of oxidation stability is down to what this molecule looks like. Without getting too far into the chemistry, the naphthalene in alkylated naphthalene, you would probably know as mothballs, right?
Yeah.
So it's like two rings which look like benzene rings that are connected together. And actually, that looks a lot like an antioxidant. So when we talk about aminic antioxidants that go into engine oils, an alkylated naphthalene looks remarkably similar to those. Now, that's not obviously the only thing. We're not putting mothballs into our oil. So the alkylation process means that we have little branching chains that come off it. And that's kind of the secret sauce of the alkylated naphthalenes. And what they do here at King is, by adjusting all of those branches, is how they get different properties out of the alkylated naphthalene.
It's a really cool little chemistry that, again, is often overlooked. It's way more common than most people realize. Group 5 base oils are generally misunderstood, which leads to a misunderstanding of synthetic oils, because synthetic is such a generic term, really.
Yeah.
And that most people think of synthetics, right, true synthetic, as only a PAO or only an ester, and they kind of miss the rest of the stuff. And this is pretty cool stuff that I think deserves more attention as well.
Yeah, agreed. Maybe watch this space.
Exactly. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.